PS5 Firmware 8.00 is here, and why? As always, you should think twice before you update. Sony just released PS5 Firmware 8.00. This is a massive update with lots of features following a lengthy beta test. PS5 Firmware 8.00 brings support for Dolby Atmos, up to 8TB for M.2 SSD, and much more. As always, if you're hoping to get a PS5 jailbreak one day, I advise against updating, while realizing it become more and more difficult to resist. Should you update your PS5? As always, if your goal is to jailbreak your console, you should simply not update. The recent history of PlayStation hacking tells us so. People who keep their console up to date do not get the jailbreaks. There hasn't been any significant rumor or announce related to a PS4 or PS5 jailbreak in a while, with firmware 9.00 for PS4 being the latest and greatest that can be jailbroken, and PS5 still technically not being fully jailbroken on any firmware, although firmwares up to 4.51 included do have access to a kernel exploit, which isn't sufficient nowadays for a full jailbreak. Of note, hacker TheFlow has recently stated that his BDJB exploit works on firmware 7.61, and it is safe to assume 8.00 as well. However, we know historically that the lower your firmware, the higher your chances of getting a jailbroken console in the future. As always, the decision is yours, but updating, in general, lowers your chances of getting a jailbreak down the line. In an ideal world, you would have two consoles, one that you keep on a low firmware for a jailbreak, or buy a low firmware one if you can find it. Tips for finding a low firmware, PS5/PS4, and one that you keep up to date in order to play your current gen games and access PlayStation online services. I know it's easier said than done, but that's how things are. TheFlow confirms his BDJB exploit still works on PS5 latest firmware 7.61. PlayStation hacker TheFlow has confirmed that his BDJB exploit still works on the latest PS5 firmware. The complete BDJB exploit chain, which constitutes a user mode entry point for hacks on the PS4/PS5, was originally made of 5 separate exploits, which TheFlow had disclosed last year. This BDJB hack is currently actively used on PS5 firmwares 3.00 to 4.51 as an entry point to the kernel exploit, which allows hacking these firmwares. As an alternative to the BDJB exploit, many of us use a WebKit exploit instead, although in both cases, the goal is to then trigger the same kernel exploit for privilege escalation. What is a bit surprising is that the hacker had stated a while ago that the BDJB vulnerabilities, or some of them, had been fixed in PS5 firmware 5.00. It is unclear to me if he has found additional exploits to reactivate the chain, if some bugs were reintroduced, if Sony never properly patched the exploits, or if it is something else. It would appear Sony simply never bothered to patch the vulnerability.